Hello.
Our story begins inside the Tantive 4, returning to the capital world of the newly formed Galactic Empire. Obi Wan and Yoda did everything they could to defeat the Sith, and in the end, it wasn't totally enough to destroy them. Lord Vader fell to his defeat on the lava world of Mustafar, while Grand Master Yoda retreated from Darth Sidious inside the once hallowed halls of the Senate Rotunda. After watching Padmé Amidala, a close friend to both the Jedi, die in childbirth on Polis Massa, Obi-Wan told Master Yoda that they had to do something. The word had been hiding. That's what Yoda wanted them to do. Go into hiding and wait until the time was right. To Master Kenobi, this was a betrayal of their oath to the galaxy that no longer wanted them. But to be a Jedi was to make the difficult decisions that no one else could. Obi-Wan reminded Yoda of their earliest instructions inside the temple. Being a Knight of the Republic wasn't meant to be easy. There's a reason so many younglings fell out of the Order. It wasn't because they weren't good enough to pass the trials, it's because being a Jedi takes a precise amount of concentration, of focus, of dedication. They needed to reasonably look at the state of the galaxy and accept that something had to be done. No one else was going to save them. The Jedi lost, and that was the burden they would have to face once they went into exile, but not before the Sith died. It would be a great disservice to the galaxy to just let Darth Sidious rise unopposed. Even if the Jedi were seen as the bringers of death and war, they still held an obligation to do the right thing. It was their duty to the people. Obi-Wan wouldn't allow the Sith to rule over the galaxy without opposition. Yoda had argued, before they ended up inside the Tantive 4, that if they died, then the children would be left unprotected. But as long as Sidious was alive, no one could guarantee their future. Whatever the Empire was capable of, it would be far worse, tenfold even, if Palpatine was allowed to continue ruling. It's where the two Jedi were now, after the debate, and after Bail Organa promised to take care of the children if they died, to make sure the Emperor never found them. The two Jedi were sitting in silence, inside a quiet personal chamber on the floor. This wasn't as much of a meditation as it was a reflection. The two Jedi thought about all of the friends they'd lost. Obi-Wan pondered on what he could have done differently to stop Anakin's fall from grace, while Yoda dwelled on his greatest failure, perhaps the greatest failure ever seen from a Grand Master. These were both internal burdens, fears if you will, that manifested in the trauma thanks to the Jedi Purge. Once the ship touched down on Coruscant, it was hard for either Obi-Wan or Yoda to leave the chamber they sat within. Darkness covered the entire galaxy, but the wound sitting inside the capital felt far worse than it did when they first arrived to save the temple. The dead were left to rot inside the ancient Jedi structure. They of course weren't Palpatine's first concern. The clones would clean up the stench of the dead Jedi when he felt that the temple was plagued enough by their rotting corpses. That very darkness was meant to be a deterrent for Jedi intending to kill him. Just an extra buffer, aside from Imperial forces, to keep the Knights of the Old Republic at bay. The two counselors couldn't possibly know where the Emperor was dwelling, but thanks to Senator Amidala's close friend inside the Senate, Ryo Chuchi, she was able to inform Bail that the Chancellor's shuttle arrived at the Grand Republic Medical Facility half a day ago. It was also hard for Ryo to refer to Palpatine as anything other than a Chancellor. That simple change of wording would be far easier to adapt to than the systematic change that faced the former Republic. Regardless, that's the location Bail told Obi-Wan and Yoda about. They might find their success if they traveled to that facility and searched for the Emperor. Maybe he was still there. If not, there might be a trail to follow. The two of them used a private civilian speeder to transport themselves across the city. It'd be fair to say that there really weren't words shared between the two of them. As it was for the 501st prior to Operation Nightfall, there was really nothing to be said. This, in their eyes, wasn't revenge. It was justice and preservation of the future. If it meant for 1,000 generations that the Jedi would be blacklisted from the public, then it was a noble sacrifice to ensure the destruction of the Sith. The galaxy needed to have the freedom to choose. That was their fight more than anything else. Once they arrived at the structure, they slipped in through an upper deck level and felt outwards through the Force. Something was alarmingly off about this structure. While the Jedi Temple emanated darkness because of the mass death, this building was somehow far worse. Not that the death wasn't overbearing as it was, but this was something that was alive, and also actively suffering. Obi-Wan felt it before Yoda did. Master Kenobi sensed a familiarity with it. All his mind went to was Anakin, naturally, but he watched his apprentice burn to death on Mustafar, so it had to be something else or someone else. He refused to tell Master Yoda that he felt Skywalker's presence, because he didn't need his ally thinking that he wasn't focused on the battle at hand. Obi-Wan shook off the sight of Anakin burning from his mind, and continued forward. Yoda was holding on to his shoulder so they could move faster around the facility, and so that the little green elder could save his energy for the fight against the Sith Lord. They moved through the halls, avoiding Imperial security in the form of clone troopers as they narrowed in on the darkness. Inside the facility at the top of the structure, Lord Vader was tied back to a medical table. His suit was sparking. The truth of Padmé's fate was revealed. Vader, in his pain, released a burst of force. It started in the destruction of the droids around the room, but it ended with Palpatine being hit by the power of the dark side. It wasn't enough for the Emperor to fear for his life. It was, though, enough to make the Sith Lord angry at his apprentice. Vader was never meant to ever lay his hands on him, not physically and definitely not with the Force. As punishment, Palpatine put Vader in his place by electrocuting him. It didn't last all that long, but the damage done to the suit was a short-term reminder of what Sidious was capable of doing. No longer would Vader get away with petty little arguments with his instructor. Palpatine's word was final. Everything he said would be obeyed. So while Vader was electrocuted several hours before their arrival, he was only now receiving repairs to his armor. Sidious needed his apprentice to bathe in the electrical pain to his circuitry. He wasn't this inevitable force in the galaxy anymore. Everything that Anakin Skywalker could have been was no more. He now had to live under the rules set in place for him by Darth Sidious. There were no outside attachments nor distractions. The only people Anakin knew personally were Obi-Wan and Yoda. Everyone else, in Palpatine's mind, had been extinguished by the Purge, and those two were not anyone he could talk to. The Dark Lord of the Sith had given his apprentice the basics of the life he'd lead as his #1 enforcer in the Empire. Vader was forced to listen to the monologue for hours. Now, his Emperor was reminding him of the Sith Code, and how it differed from the Jedi one. After the medical droids fixed his suit, he'd be going to the Jedi Temple to meet the new leader of the Inquisitor unit. Sidious, obviously, would allow Grand Inquisitor and Vader to meet under the guise of surprise. But before that could all transpire, he finished his reiteration of the Sith Code. Just as he prepared to order his apprentice to go and visit the Jedi Temple, the doors behind him opened. Palpatine turned around to see two Jedi Masters raising their lightsabers. The Sith Lord rolled his surviving lightsaber into his hand in disbelief. How did they find him? Why did they return? The visible distress and disbelief on the Emperor's face gave a surge of confidence to the Jedi. They rushed him, and Sidious planted his foot with a jab forward. He was immediately thrown into another engagement with the Jedi. This would be an all-time record for him, 3 duels in 3 consecutive days. At the end, though, he had to remember that he had survived each of the other 2. Kenobi was his first target off the bat. He recalled Dooku's ease in defeating the Jedi Master. He should be the first to go. Kenobi, who remained focused on lightsaber defense, was the perfect counter to Darth Sidious, who, like Maul, used Form 6 the most. The two of them were very similar combatants, because obviously Sidious trained Maul, and thanks to Yoda's overwhelmingly aggressive presence, Palpatine couldn't just lob Obi-Wan away. The strategy for this type of duel had to be different. As it slowly progressed through the medical bay, Palpatine realized that he couldn't just win by tricking the Jedi or by separating them. He had to play to each of their weaknesses. After believing that he bested Yoda inside the Senate Rotunda, his battle strategy slowly transformed into defeating the Grand Master first and saving Obi-Wan for last. Yoda's energy would dissipate far before Obi-Wan's would, and it felt like Sidious doubted Kenobi's skills. Also, and it should be noted, that unlike the Invisible Hand duel, there wasn't a lot of room inside the medical facility for Palpatine to throw him, so even if Sidious had a moment to throw Obi-Wan, it likely wouldn't be enough to knock him out of the fight. The Jedi didn't pay any mind to Palpatine's churning mind, but Obi-Wan slowly became distracted by the wheezing creature on the medical table to their side. The essence of the figure felt familiar, and he did not know why. Vader was bobbing his shoulders so that he could break free, but his suit was entirely shut down, so that the repairs could be done, mostly to help Sidious control his pet further. Palpatine and Yoda crossed blades. Obi-Wan switched from form 3 to 4 and drove his weapon downwards in a stab, catching Palpatine in the wrist. Sidious pulled back, clocking Kenobi with the back of his hand, but by the time his saber swung around, Obi-Wan was back in defense. Yoda then leapt through the air, immediately getting blinded by Sidious's electricity. Kenobi was singled out, surprising the Jedi Master, as Yoda rolled backwards across the ground with sparks flickering off of him. Obi-Wan wasn't afraid though. He'd beaten Grievous and Vader in a 24-hour span. He stepped away, drawing his weapon before his face and immediately blocking the Dark Lord's strike. Kenobi and Sidious moved elegantly through the room, as Sidious took a moment to compliment Obi-Wan's mastery. Never had he respected that Jedi Master, and he might as well have the satisfaction of a compliment before his inevitable death. Obi-Wan eyed Sidious's rapid strikes in, before ducking out of the way, completely avoiding the fight. His saber deignited and he bounced behind a pillar, before swinging out and reigniting his lightsaber. Palpatine nearly fell for the trick, but he was ready. Yoda, behind them, jumped to his feet and thrusted his hand forward. Obi-Wan passed around the side of Sidious's hip, leaving his other one vulnerable. He then slammed into the wall with the force being thrown at him by Yoda, and Kenobi swung in, forcing their blades to hold in place, as the Grand Master leapt through the air and stabbed his lightsaber through Sidious's shoulder, down into his heart, and just a tiny little bit outside of his ribs. It was a perfect dagger that killed him. The Emperor dropped to the ground as the two Jedi turned their attention to the individual on the medical bay table. Whatever that thing was, it needed to die. The two of them walked up to Vader with their weapons ready. Yoda pulled his back, preparing to end its life, and Obi-Wan stopped him. His saber pointed forward and he asked if that was Anakin inside. The machine squirmed, but aside from the respirator and his head, he could not move. Under the mask, the tortured soul of Anakin Skywalker continued to toil with his decisions. He knew he couldn't defend himself, and once Sidious died, he knew that his life too was over. Anakin answered the question by nodding his head, and Obi-Wan covered his mouth. Tears bubbled under his eyes, and he stepped away for a moment. Yoda looked to the Jedi Master, his firm brows receding, and he looked back to Vader. There was so much pain, and then the voice spoke out, saying that they need not forgive him. He just wanted to know one truth: if Padmé was safe, and if she was okay. The two Jedi looked to each other as Obi-Wan walked away, choking back tears. He had been brave when fighting Anakin on Mustafar, and he held it together when he defeated his apprentice. Never did he think that Anakin would survive, and be forced into a suit of torture for his failure. Kenobi didn't regret it, but the guilt was still immeasurable, because it was his greatest failure as a Jedi instructor. Yoda confirmed Padmé's death. He wanted to kill Vader, and extinguish the Sith in one, but even now it was clear that Anakin was not a Sith, yet he was no Jedi either. The two of them decided that maybe the best path forward was one without death, but penance, a life service to the Jedi Order for the pain Anakin caused. Yoda watched Vader and extinguished his lightsaber, releasing the restraints on Vader's arms. The Dark Lord dropped to the ground and Obi-Wan turned back. Yoda looked to Master Kenobi and told him that Skywalker would follow them into exile. His sins against the Jedi Order were not yet forgiven. They would escape from the medical facility with ease, and then from Coruscant without struggle, thanks to Imperial personnel flocking to the medical bay where the Emperor died. Bail Organa escorted the Jedi to a temporary new home on the planet of Deservo, inside the Tyon cluster. Yoda suggested territory near Raxus Secundus, not because he trusted the Separatists, but because no one would expect the Jedi to go there. Before leaving for the Tyon cluster, Master Kenobi returned to the temple, and dispatched another encrypted message to the galaxy. The Jedi finally had a place to call home. For 15 years, the Jedi would move between Deservo and Raxus Secundus. They were not in the public spotlight. They avoided run-ins with the Galactic Empire and Separatist rebels while they existed. Without Palpatine at the head of the regime in power, they didn't need to worry about orders designed to get them killed. Thanks to the encrypted message, the surviving 100-plus Jedi trickled back to Deservo, including the last of the Sith by a technicality. Yes, even after defeating Tyrannus, Vader, and Sidious, they still had to defeat the Grand Inquisitor. But he was dead before any other Jedi found refuge on Deservo. Darth Vader, or Anakin Skywalker, remained with the Jedi on the planet while they rebuilt. His armor was given a different color. and Yoda kept him entirely isolated from the returning Jedi. He was put in isolation as a lesson to the Jedi, including Yoda, but also for Anakin's own lesson. The survivors of the Purge needed to learn how to identify darkness and survive it. At the same time, Skywalker had to embrace isolation and allow it to surround him without destroying him. This was a positive message for both sides of Purge survivors, though it should be said and noted that because of the torment he caused the galaxy, Anakin would not be allowed to learn of his children until after their 5th year inside the Tyon cluster. This was again another test for the former Jedi traitor. He would sometimes fluctuate between light and dark in his isolation. His children knew the truth about him, and they were permitted to choose if they wanted to have a relationship with their father or not. But the point is, Vader was not introduced to his children until the Jedi could test his reaction. To their surprise, Anakin did not rage out of control. He accepted this deal, and he also understood if his children wanted to have a relationship with him or not. He did, in the end, kill their mother. With over 100 Jedi on Deservo for more than half a decade, the Jedi relocated to just a system over at Raxus. Thanks to the Clone Wars ending over 5 years before their migration, the planet was safe from Imperial occupation. The Jedi wanted to live on a very civilized system like Raxus Secundus, but also remain decently isolated from the population. It ended up working in their favor. It also was to no surprise that this decision came when Luke and Leia were ready to join the Order. Up until the Great Migration from Deservo to Raxus, 4 Jedi Masters had been instructing the twins on Alderaan, where they were raised with Breya and Bail. These 4 teachers were Obi Wan, Yoda, Coleman Kaj, and Carrick Infilla. All of them separately traveled to Alderaan and did their own iteration of instruction, which worked to the great benefit of the twins. They were each extremely capable Force users and everything their father should have been at that age. It made Obi-Wan and Yoda wish that they had discovered Anakin at birth, rather than late into childhood. The move to Raxus wasn't a total restart. It had long been a part of their plans, so they simply, in their words, expanded. The Jedi relationship with Bail Organa came with Alderaanian building permits on Raxus. This was to construct a series of homes with a central temple for religious rites of passage for the people that lived on Alderaan. The way Bail explained it to Raxus leadership and Imperial authority in the Senate was that due to the several million refugees brought to Alderaan following the Clone War, the people required an actual location to hold their religious gatherings. These people did actually exist too, and they would share the temple with the Jedi 2 times a year for a week apiece, but it obviously was not the main priority of building this camp. To keep Skywalker in check during this period of time away from the galaxy, the Jedi employed guerrilla tactics on syndicate forces, like that of Maul's Crimson Dawn. The former Sith assassin was killed in action against Kenobi and Ahsoka on a mission to liberate slaves from Kessel. Skywalker, in his modified, newly colored Vader suit, participated in some of these raids. He was known by the galaxy as the Jedi Liberator. This wasn't exactly a positive nickname either. He wasn't very liked. It was a stark contrast to his war hero self from the Clone War, yet it was something Skywalker embraced. At this point of 15 years following the Jedi Purge, the Order was in a positive state. It rebuilt, now with well over 250 members. Some of the newest weren't even children. Yoda and Jocasta Nu changed the rules, allowing for monks, priests, and guardians of the wills to become members of their order. There were also children that they brought in, but their responsibility in the galaxy had changed. Without the Emperor, the galactic regime slowly fell into the control of the warlords that held influence both politically and militaristically. The Empire itself didn't spend a huge sum of credits on its military, meaning that once the clones retired, they needed to fill their ranks with volunteers. But it also wasn't exactly the most promising career opportunity. Longtime Imperial generals and admirals that served during the Clone War were all heavy drinkers, gamblers, and frequently got in deep with the sharks. The real war for the Empire was against its own military. Ever since the Jedi destroyed Maul and collapsed the powerhouse Crimson Dawn, the syndicates moved in the shadows. There were not 10,000 Jedi protecting the galaxy anymore. It was far easier for the crime lords to hire bounty hunters to work in their place. The Empire was a very weak structure. It still had the corruption of the Republic, the lies of the Confederacy, and the inefficiency of the Neutral Systems Coalition. It had the worst attribute of every Clone War era government, and the fragile military structure was a promised lie. The crime families realized that the terrible payroll for Imperial officers would make them even more susceptible to corruption. First, they turned a blind eye to organizational spice trade, and from there, the officers themselves were easy to buy. Drugs were filling the streets from every Imperial planet from Quen to Coruscant. TK troopers weren't much aid to that because they were pretty much more expendable than the trash droids were, and they were just as easy to buy as officers. The government, even with Organa, Mothma, and Chuchi making influential legislation, weren't capable enough to deter this corruption. Aside from the civilian struggle with a weak internal defense against the crime families, it didn't become an overwhelming problem until a collection of warlords behind Fleet Admiral Rampart turned against the Empire for a better payroll from Jabba the Hutt specifically. Orders from Rampart weren't extremely vicious at first. Sometimes it'd be Imperial troopers apprehending local police forces and putting them at bay, while crime bosses moved their various supplies through the unprotected streets of highly populated areas. Sometimes, accidental, free samples would be dropped for people to take and get addicted to. Of course, it wasn't accidental. The more people that bought their supply, the richer the syndicate would grow. It didn't become a known problem to the Jedi until Admiral Rampart deployed his Venator fleet outside of Coruscant to threaten the galactic capital. The Senate was already stuck in a filibuster for a military expansion bill, after one of Organa's allies reported that there was frustration growing within Imperial ranks. He brought the issue to the Senate, but they were busy debating whether or not they should give more tax breaks to the Commerce Guild, which did survive the Clone War because Palpatine didn't absorb it into his assets to build the Death Star. Those tax breaks would, in turn, take more funding away from the military. Admiral Rampart's move wasn't just on behalf of the criminal syndicates, backed by Jabba the Hutt, but also reminiscent of how the Trade Federation blockaded Naboo to make a point to the Republic decades before. The Jedi, as a result of this, had to act. They couldn't allow the galaxy to sink back into civil war. It also wasn't totally lost on them that the Galactic Empire was a corrupt state of government. Kenobi and Yoda simply still believed in Bail Organa. In their defense, Mothma had done a great job of uniting the Senate around Bail. In another year, it was highly suspected and even predicted that one of the big three, being Organa, Chuchi, or Mothma, would make a run for the Senate leadership position. That all hinged, though, on the response from the Jedi Order, and they didn't know it yet. Kenobi designated the strike teams, one to take out criminal leadership, with the other forcing the Imperial warlord to surrender. The Jedi may have not been privy to everything done by the criminal syndicates, but they also weren't totally blind. They'd been tracking Jabba because since the fall of the Sith, it had become clear that he was the rising power in the galaxy, especially after Maul. They pretty much had everything mapped out and were going to give the information to the Empire, but now, a strike team of Kirik and Phila, Anakin, Kanan Jarrus, and a few other Jedi Knights were tasked with breaking through Jabba's palace and killing him. At the same time, Master Kenobi would lead Coleman Kaj, Quinlan Vos, Barriss Offee, and a couple dozen other Jedi to the fleet above Coruscant. Thanks to their position at Raxus Secundus, they'd be permitted to get to each destination at around the same time, using unsuspecting transports to do so. Luke and Leia each were both very eager to go on this mission, but it was decided that this wasn't their time yet. Masters Yoda and Obi Wan were seen as their fathers from their perspective. They did have their own relationship with Anakin, but not a tight one. It was because Leia remembered her mother's death. She also remembered sensing Obi-Wan and Yoda's presence there. It was in her belief that Padmé's trust for these two Jedi were enough guidance for her to follow. She communicated that to Luke, and he agreed with her reasoning. Regardless, Master Yoda explained that they didn't want the two of them on this mission, not because they weren't capable, but because this was not their burden. It was highlighted that the Jedi participating in this mission all served during the Clone War. It was their job to end off the last stench of darkness remaining from the Sith-started war. Yoda wanted Luke and Leia to be the leaders of the future, the ones who never had to experience the decadence of war, but also understood what it would cost the galaxy if it came. If you will, knowledgeable but not traumatized. Whether or not his logic was right would be determined by their actions in the future. Thanks to the separate groups descending on syndicate targets in the core and in the Outer Rim, Jabba didn't have a proper response. The Jedi had been nothing more than a nagging issue. They weren't prominent enough to actually worry about, and ironically for the Hutts, despite being the most powerful criminal regime in the galaxy, they weren't very armed either. Their influence came through imperial corruption, not homebred power. When Kirik and Phila led the Jedi against Jabba's palace, they faced very little resistance. The Hutts had their own defense force, but with a powerful Jedi warrior leading the assault, the capable Hutt defenses crumbled immediately. Gamorrean guards paired with Black Chrysanthemum were crushed with both force and saber, leaving Jabba to be a victim of Anakin Skywalker, who for the first time since becoming Vader, actually allowed his vengeance to control his actions. He showed resolve when his children were introduced to him. He understood his penance and his service to the Jedi Order. He could not make an exception for the Hutts. They were not a peaceful organization, and the Jedi had to send a message to the Outer Rim. This idea and how bad it technically sounded wasn't lost on Kirak. He decided though to turn a blind eye to it, as the Jedi attack force continued sweeping through pirates and scum. On the other side of the galaxy, Obi Wan's strike force, posing as a Hutt carrier, landed inside an old Venator. Without the Tarkin Doctrine or Emperor Palpatine, there were like 3 active Imperial Star Destroyers in the entire galaxy. The rest were Venators from the Clone War. They were smaller, had less crew, and were significantly easier to maintain. Didn't mean it was an easy strike for the Jedi. Without being cooked in the Twin Suns, a finely aged Obi Wan led his Jedi on a frontal assault against TK troopers, and they certainly were. Without clone commandos leading their training regiments and the bulk of the clone army retiring within the last 10 years, these men were poorly trained, and their morale was unbelievably low. They could fire a blaster down a corridor who couldn't, which certainly was a death trap for the Jedi, but none of them had ever seen a Jedi before. Imagine being a 21-year-old recruit that joined the Navy to get out of Corellia or some other scum-ridden place, and during your first deployment, your boss takes you to Coruscant to blackmail the government. And instead of a response from said government, 50 magic men rush out of a pirate transport. These people didn't just use glow sticks, but also mind powers. So you, as a private, getting paid dirt cheap, ordered by a gambling addict, had a couple choices. Die for an empire that you really don't care about, get stabbed by a guy that was supposed to be dead for 15 years, or get thrown across the corridor and then get stabbed. The choices were simple for most of these men. The Jedi assault on the capital ship was certainly more difficult than the one on Tatooine, just because there were more TK troopers than pirates, but once they got to the bridge, the results were pretty similar. Obi-Wan wouldn't order the direct execution of Admiral Rampart. Instead, the Imperial officer's information would be sprawled out inside of his office. Of course, spice and gambling addicts aren't really put together that well or extremely competent, so all the information they really wanted was just laying out. As the Jedi found out through their very quick investigations on Tatooine and over Coruscant, the Imperial military was unbelievably corrupt. They sold their souls to the Hutts, and the other syndicates were just now biting on the opportunity. It was entirely up to the Senate to solve this problem. Though it should be said that once the Jedi sent all the information they attained to the Senate, it wouldn't be an easy fix inside the government, because the Jedi weren't going to fix this for them. Bail Organa, probably the most influential man inside the Senate, took this information to heart. His continuous attempts to fund the military now had evidence to prove why it was a good idea. Maybe he didn't like having an overly large navy due to the Clone War, but if they didn't pay their troops, they wouldn't have an empire. The fleet over Coruscant remained for weeks, even after the Jedi left, but with Rampart being detained by the Jedi and brought back to Raxus, the entire fleet was left with low morale, no orders, and no one willing to test the Jedi. There was internal bickering, yeah sure, and even some fights, but nothing to make the fleet act against the capital. The Senate broke the filibuster and voted to fund the military, but at the same time, a huge investigation would begin into the actions of said military. Their corruption went all the way from the top down to the bottom, and it had to be exposed, which through years of resources, credit spent, and incarcerations against participating troopers, it would be torn down. It would give the Empire the perfect opportunity to attack the Outer Rim, but because of Jabba's death, thanks again to the Jedi, it was already chaos by the time they arrived. Jabba was a unifying factor, especially for the Hutt crime family. Once he died, it all fell apart, and never after his death did they really have the chance to regather everything they started under his rule. The Jedi Order were the unsung heroes of this. They stopped a full-blown military takeover of Coruscant by cutting the literal head off the snake. Guess you could say slug cause Jabba, but you get the point. At the end of their attack, Master Yoda would promote Obi-Wan to Grand Master, giving him full control over the Order. Kenobi had been studying Yoda's every move since the Purge, and it was his time. Yoda would inversely take Luke and Leia on a spiritual journey across the stars to prepare them for knighthood. Obi-Wan would allow their father's fate with the Jedi to be decided by the twins. It would actually be Leia that would free him from his service to the Jedi Order. Not that he was suffering in service to the Jedi, but after Leia saw what he had done to the Hutts, which reversed corruption on the galactic level, she believed that he should live freely. This did result in her and her brother visiting their father more, since he wasn't always around on Raxus for them to actually talk to. So they could go and visit, and really start building a relationship if they wanted to. He returned to Naboo to live in solitude and start his life over. His children, though, remained as Jedi and continued to train as knights after their promotion, as he became a Boken. Ahsoka, who floated between the Order and also a state of Boken, returned full-time after Anakin departed. She had a much harder time interacting with him than anyone else did. She forgave him for his sins, but still rarely could visit him. The Senate, following the passing of the military funding bill, would elect Bail Organa as their majority leader. He'd represent the real transformation of the Galactic Empire. It's not that he, Chuchi, or Mothma never tried, it was just the fact that the Empire was always corrupt. It needed to be reminded how fragile their system was, which Rampart's coup did, for the government to anoint one of their own as the quote-unquote savior of their power. Bail would usher in the golden age of Imperial rule, but at the end of the day, the Empire by the time he left wasn't much of an actual empire, more of a parliamentary republic with the name Empire. With the Force maintaining long-term balance thanks to the destruction of the Sith over 15 years before, it would become the responsibility of the twins to ensure that balance remained. As the old masters wanted, they'd rise to leadership with knowledge of what the galaxy was capable of, but without the trauma, aside from losing their mother, of experiencing total galactic conflict. Thanks to the Impure Reformation under Bail, the Jedi could actually focus on maintaining the peace themselves, while the former Republic military descended on the Outer Rim and conquered criminal territory. Thanks to the crucial actions of Yoda and Obi-Wan after Padmé's death, they were able to ensure the Force didn't fall into total chaos, while also allowing the Empire a chance to become a sustainable government that could, like the Jedi, work for everyone. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Sith Clone Wars out every Saturday. You know what is? Let's talk about this story. So this is like kind of, the most reasonable thing the Jedi could have ever done. They certainly make some choice decisions at the end of Revenge, but in all fairness, the OT has to exist, so they do anyways. But this decision felt kind of natural. I was actually really surprised that I hadn't covered this topic yet, just because it feels super duper natural. It's just like natural sequence, like why wouldn't they go back for Palpatine? And while I think that Yoda was afraid of failing and did want to leave the children without protection, this is the right path for the Jedi. I did want Obi-Wan and Yoda to have this direction where it's like, we gotta do this regardless of what happens to us. If we don't win, then someone has to take care of the twins, but at least we tried doing what a Jedi's supposed to do. Palpatine's just seriously too dangerous to be left alive. It just is the case. And that's what I wanted to have proven here. I also wanted the Jedi to kind of decide on how they wanted to handle Anakin. I did have this idea with Yoda going in to kill him and Obi-Wan stopping him, but I felt that was too drastic even for Yoda. And so instead you have this decision where both the Jedi realize, like, okay, we can use him to help us rebuild the Order, and not in a state of slavery, but in a state of servitude, because he wronged the Order, it's only right that he should help it come back. As for the twins, it was a little difficult not making them a main part of the second half of the story, but at the end, I think this story, more than anything, is an Obi-Wan and Yoda story. Yoda and Obi-Wan are kind of seen as these parental figures to Luke and Leia. They are more so their fathers, and that's really what I wanted to be the main takeaway, is that Obi-Wan and Yoda are genuinely the people who raise Luke and Leia. Sure, they're raised with the Organas on Alderaan, but Luke and Leia see Obi-Wan and Yoda as their true parents. And so I wanted this to be their story. Yoda obviously focusing on the training side, while Obi-Wan starts to emerge as a Grand Master. And so that's why Obi-Wan's in charge of the attack on Rampart and Jabba, while also becoming Grand Master in the end. And so I think that's how you get kind of the best end result for both Kenobi's story and Yoda's story, while also allowing Luke and Leia's story to be up to your own interpretation. I like to think that, they have like kind of a better relationship with Anakin, but not super close, and that they also become what Obi-Wan is in the end, by becoming the leaders of the Jedi Order and leading it into a promising future. So kind of wholesome, kind of rigid, but I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always, my friends, may the Force be with you.